Welcome to Let's Talk, Designing Quality Conversations for Google Assistant. My name is Jessica Danae Earley-Cha, and I'm a developer advocate for Actions on Google.
And I'm Cathy Pearl, head of Conversation Design Outreach. And if you want to tweet about our talk, that would be awesome. Be sure and use the hashtag AOGDevs. Over the last few days, you've been hearing a lot about how developers can add their content to the Google Assistant by creating something called an action. And you can think of an action kind of like an application on our platform, Actions on Google. And it enables people to have a conversation with a Google Assistant about any content that you want to put out there. And it'll be available on lots of different devices. And we've got tools and options to help you get started.
Definitely. There's tons of different ways to make an action. And we actually recently released several new ways. And so if you're a content owner, let's say you have a how-to guide or a video on YouTube, you can add that content using templates or markup. If you're an Android developer, you could connect your Android app to Google Assistant with app actions. And then, of course, if you're a hardware developer, you want to connect all your really cool devices using our Smart Home SDK. And what's really cool is the first three, Google Assistant handles the natural language processing for you. So you don't have to manage the back and forth and figuring out what the user really means, which is fantastic. But what's really, really great is there is a space where you could be really creative. And this is where we have conversation actions and using tools like interactive canvas, where you create completely new experiences for your users.
And as Jessica mentioned, sometimes the how-tos, the app actions and things like that aren't necessarily everything you need to create your interesting and complex experience. So in that case, a custom action is a great way to go. And when you build a custom action in particular, you really need to think about design. We've all had very frustrating experiences with our voice assistants, and a lot of times that's not because there was a technical issue, but because it was poorly designed. And we want to help you build the best custom actions possible.
And we know that when designers and developers, when we work together, quality goes up, and the likelihood of users returning to your action goes up too.
We also know that not every developer has their own personal designer.
I do. So today we're going to walk through a bunch of different examples and things that you could do today to make better quality conversations.
So let's talk about conversation design. And the first rule of conversation design is to write sample dialogues. You can think of a sample dialogue kind of like a movie script. It's basically a back and forth between your user and the assistant. And it's a great way to get started, brainstorming, trying out new ideas, sharing them with stakeholders. And don't worry about getting them perfect, because believe me, the first time I write my sample dialogue is never perfect. It's never the thing I use in the end. Just remember that old rule, there's no such thing as good writing. There is only good rewriting. And just like when you're in Hollywood and you're writing a movie script, you do a table read. You read them out loud. Take your sample dialogues, find a few people, read them back and forth. It's great if you can find someone to be your user who's not familiar with your design. And you will quickly discover problems and bugs that you had no idea were there before you've written a single line of code. So Jessica, why don't we do a sample dialogue right here, right now, on stage?
Sounds great.
All right, let's say we're going to make an action that lets you rate jokes.
Okay.
Will you be my user?
Of course I'll be the user, and you'll be the action.
All right.
Okay. Hey, Google, talk to Joke Rater.
Welcome to Joke Rater. I'll tell you a joke, and you can rate it. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. What's brown and sticky? A stick. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to have them rate it like 1 to 5 or like a Likert scale. Or
remember, Cathy, we're supposed to just do the sample dialogue, not what actually happens.
All right. Now, rate that joke. You might be wondering, why did Jessica and I have our backs turned? That might seem a little strange. And that's because when humans communicate, they do so much more than just use words. There's eye gaze, there's body language, there's pauses, there's intonation. All these things that, guess what, the computer is not going to get. So you really want to focus on the words. And when we're back to back, it forces you to do that. If I was talking to Jessica and one of my prompts was kind of confusing, she might just kind of look at me. And I'd probably just naturally repeat myself. But your computer is not going to be able to do that. So when you do back to back, you're forced to focus on just the words. Let's walk through an example of a sample dialogue that we wrote down for a fake action called Cool Animal Facts. Will you be my user again?
Of course, Cathy.
All right.
Okay, Google. Talk to cool animal facts.
Welcome to Cool Animal Facts. What animal would you like to know about?
I love penguins.
Cool, penguins. Would you like to know about their habitat or what they like to eat?
What they like to eat.
Penguins can eat up to 13 pounds of fish, krill, and squid a day. By the way, male penguins spend time sitting on the eggs, while the females go out to get fish. Now, would you like to hear more about penguins or ask about another animal?
I'm done, thanks.
Sure, thanks for talking to Cool Animal Facts. Goodbye. So there's a couple things I want to point out about this sample dialogue. The first one is how we started things off. We said, welcome to Cool Animal Facts. That's pretty straightforward. You know what we're going to be about. The next thing we did was we had a very specific question. Which animal would you like to know about? We didn't say like, how you doing? How can I help you? That's going to be way too much for the user to understand, and they won't be successful. The other thing I want to point out is after I finished telling Jessica some facts about penguins, I asked her, do you want to hear more about penguins or ask about another animal? And she didn't say either of those things. I told her what to say, and she didn't say it. But that's okay, because she did something that a person would very naturally do to end the conversation gracefully at that point, which is, I'm done, thanks. So you really need to remember that people won't necessarily say the exact thing you've said, but they'll say something appropriate for that time within the conversation. I also want to mention we have a lot of great best practices and guidelines on our website at actions.google.com/design. This URL will be on the last slide as well. And we've got great stuff about how to get started, how to write sample dialogues, all these things. A lot of times people ask us, well, how many of these sample dialogues do I need to write? And there's no hard and fast rule. If your action is more complex, you should probably write some more. But there's two types you really want to focus on. First, there's something called the happy path. That's when everything is going great. Your users are saying things you can understand, you're moving the conversation along, kind of like the Cool Animal Facts one we just did. But sometimes things don't go perfectly. Humans say things in a really big variety of ways. And there's going to be times, especially with voice and natural language understanding, where you didn't get what they said. And you need to get them gracefully back on track. So be sure and write some of those sample dialogues. I'm going to be talking a bit more about error handling a little later. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand it off to Jessica to talk about greetings and setting expectations.
Awesome, thanks, Cathy. Okay, so Cathy and I, when we first started this talk, we introduced ourselves and we let you know what we're going to be talking about, conversational actions and how to make them better, or make them higher quality at least. And so setting expectations is really important when your action is first being used by your users. Because if we don't have good expectations, users could be confused on what the possible opportunities your action is providing. And so setting expectations and being very clear on what options users have is really important, especially when it comes to the greeting. So let's look at some greetings. This is a fictional action that we designed called pet adoption. In this action, all it does is you could browse different animals that you could adopt if you're looking to adopt a furry friend. And so let's look at an example of a greeting that someone had used prior, and we'll be pulling this apart and talking about how we can make this better. So the greeting that they had was, hello, let's find you your perfect furry friend. To start, say, find an animal, or ask a question. There's a couple of things that are not always as obvious when it comes to this greeting and how it could get better. So let's dive into it. A user might read this or hear this and think, oh, I can ask any question. And so a user might say, are poodles smart? But again, this action doesn't actually answer those type of questions. It's all about adoption. And it left this user a little confused, and most likely this action is going to use the default fallback intent, just going, sorry, what was that? Which isn't a great experience for users. So one of the big things, just like Cathy mentioned earlier, when you have in your greeting a question that's very open, it's hard for users to necessarily know what their options are. And so saying things like ask a question or how can I help you could be a little too vague in the greeting. Those are great later in the conversation once the user knows more about your action and what's possible. Another thing, which is a little strange, is for the user having to say find an animal when this action is only about finding animals. So it's an extra turn of conversation that the user has to do, which is not necessary. And so Cathy and I, we played with this, and we rewrote it to being, hello, let's find your perfect friend, perfect pet. What type of animal are you looking for? And so right here, it's a little shorter, and it's more explicit. We're looking for a friend, What kind of animal would you like? And then, of course, in the back end, we have to be able to handle this. And so this idea of an animal, we need to handle and manage. And so we're going to be asking about an animal type. It could be a dog, a cat, or different breeds. And so our action needs to be able to process that. And that could be really challenging if we don't have tools to help us. And so many developers use, when it comes to actions on Google, we use Dialogflow. Dialogflow will be acting as our natural language processor, and it does what is called intent matching. It gets the user's utterance, what the user says, and figures out which one does it match with best to what the developer has put into Dialogflow as options or possible conversation paths. And so it does that intent matching, trying to figure out, the user said this, where does it go to? And then what's really great is it does entity extraction, which means it could get different pieces of data from the user's utterance and pass that as a parameter to our backend. And so the idea of an animal type could be grabbed from the user's saying and passed to us as a parameter, and we could query our database to pick out the best animals for this user. So to go back, this particular example, we have an intent where it's a possible functionality in Dialogflow called available animal. And when a user says the animal, we're going to be able to grab that animal type, pass it in as a parameter, and it goes to my backend to the available animal function that I have in my backend. So that was a really short, kind of simple example of a greeting. Let's talk about one that's a little meatier that has multiple options and we want to present to the user. So there's an action called GDG, which is Google Developer Group, that Cathy and I both wrote, which was fantastic. She was amazing with it. And this action was designed, it's an open source project, so then these GDGs, which are community groups that focus on Google technologies, and they're amazing, so shout out to GDGs, where they could connect their Meetup API to provide information like the events that they have, how many members they have, who are the organizers. And so for this one, it's going to be a little bit of a more meatier greeting that we're going to explore. So Cathy and I ended up with this. Welcome to GGG San Francisco. I can tell you about the organization, how many members we have, or about events. What would you like to know about? And with this one, each option is tied into Dialogflow, into a particular intent that I have. And so if a user says about an organization or GDG, it will hit my GDG intent in Dialogflow, and it will process information from there. So the call of action is really important in making sure that for each string of dialogue, there's something connected that the user could do next. Another thing is this is written well, but we want to play with the sound of it. How do you hear it? How does this device actually speak to the user? Because this is the first time the user is going to use this action. We want to make sure that's great. So we use SSML, which is a markup language, where you could change the audio of the assistant. You could change the pitch, you could make it talk slower, faster, add really cool audio elements into there too. It's fantastic. And so we played with SSML to make these changes to the greeting. So let's go to the console and check that out. Okay, so I'm here on my Actions on Google console. I am under Test in the simulator. Right here in the middle is the history of the conversation, so you'll see the back and forth. On the right-hand side, there's a lot of cool tabs. We'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to invoke this action, which is an action that's only accessible to me at this moment because it's not deployed, and it's all about I/O, and I'll have different options there. So let me talk to my desktop.
Sure, getting the test version of my test app.
Hello Google I/O 2019.
Ooh. Okay, so now I'm going to say GDG greeting, which is going to match my intent in this particular project and give that GDG San Francisco greeting. Would love for you guys just to listen to it to hear how it sounds.
Welcome to GDG San Francisco. I can tell you about the organization, how many members we have, or about events. Which would you like to know about?
That sounds all right, but let me show you where you can make some changes and play with SSML. And so on here on the right-hand side, we have the request and response objects, and then we have an audio tab. So let's click there. In here, you could see the text that I passed in, and that dialog flow gives to actions on Google. Google Assistant will say to the user. And so I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to paste in some SSML with that same verbiage with a couple little tweaks. So I'm going to update this so we could hear how this sounds now.
Welcome to GDG San Francisco. I can tell you about the organization, how many members we have, or about events. Which would you like to know about?
So we made a couple of small changes here to make the introduction sound a bit better. The first one is that we put a little bit of a break between the options that were presented and the question. And the reason for that is that this is probably the first time your user has encountered this particular action, and they're not really sure what to expect. So there's a little bit of time to do some cognitive processing to think, oh, those are the options, one am I going to use before we ask that question. So we put in a short break. The other one is that I actually replaced the question mark with a period at that the end question, which you might think is a little odd. Why would I do that? That's because a lot of times when we ask questions, we don't always use a rising intonation, like, how are you? A lot of times when we ask a question, we're actually using a falling intonation, the same as when we make a statement. Which one would you like to know? And that made it sound a little more natural. And of course, you're not going to be able to probably listen to every single prompt within your action, so you should focus on a few key places, such as the initial greeting, which again is going to be the first thing that the user is going to hear, and you want to make a good first impression. So spend some time listening to that, tweaking it, and seeing what sounds the best.
Definitely. Thanks, Cathy. So of course, when Cathy and I sat down, we made these changes. I'm like, that's so cool, but I don't want to have a period and my user seeing that. They're going to be like, Jessica, that's not right grammar. So first thing I did, of course, was check our client library to see how do we handle this. And so this is just a code snippet using our JavaScript client library. And whenever you make a simple response, you could pass in two different strings, one for the speech and one for the text. That way you could have a little bit of a difference when it comes to what is the audio and what is going to be what the users are going to see. And so you can have the experience slightly different and unique for the different types of modalities that the user is going to experience with your action. So we talked about the greeting, and now the next thing we want to talk about is when users come back, how can we make it even better or personalized for those users? And so we're going to still talk about the greeting slightly. But first, I just want to tell you a story about how I met Cathy. Of course, this is exactly our dialogue that we did. I went, hi, I'm Jessica, and I'm a developer advocate for Google Assistant. Oh, I talk about actions on Google. Do you want to learn about our code labs, our sample actions, or our GitHub samples?
Code labs.
And that's exactly how we met.
Exactly.
But you can imagine the 10th time I meet Cathy, if I go, hi, I'm Jessica, developer advocate, that's not very nice to Cathy because it just shows I didn't even remember that I talked to her before. That's not cool. And so our actions might have that same type of feeling to our users as well. And so let's talk about creating custom greetings for users that we've seen the first time and users we see later in the more times later in time. So this is another example that we have where we have the property called last seen. And on the conversation object, which is the object that's being passed between Google Assistant Dialogflow and us as a third-party developer, there's this property, last seen, and it gives you the datetime object in a string format of the last time you've seen the user. So really simply, you could do, if I've seen them before, I'm going to give them the hi again, acknowledge that I've seen them, and potentially change the greeting to be a little shorter, a little more simpler. And of course, if we haven't seen them before, we could give them the longer greeting of, hello, this is who I am, let me tell you all the things. And so you could do something like that to make your users feel as though, yeah, I acknowledge, we've done this before, which is great. So let's go back to the pet adoption example. And again, this one's all about being able to find your next furry friend for users. And we're going to be getting a lot of information from the user so we could best give the best pet for that user. And so I remember when I was looking for a furry friend about 6 years ago, I wanted a poodle type of dog. I definitely did not want one that was a puppy, but I was open to other ones, and the size was okay. I was open. But the one thing that was consistent in all of my searches was my zip code. And so let's talk about how we could offer to the user to remember the zip code so that it's a little easier for the user next time. So I'll pretend that we're in the conversation. This is the first time we ask for the zip code, and they give it to us, right? And then our action could provide, here are the 3 free friends we found. It has a really great carousel, shows the images of the animals. And then in that same turn of conversation, there's going to be another bubble where it says, do you want me or should I remember that zip code for next time? That way the user doesn't have to provide it again. And then of course the user could say yes or no. And so let's see how we could do this in code. So this is, again, in JavaScript. And I have 2 intents that are handling this information. So let's focus on the top intent. Here we have the available animals, and let's pretend that this gets activated once they give me a zip code. Then I do that because that'll be the last question I ask the user. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that zip code as a parameter, and I'm going to save it to the com.data, which is short-term data saving that you could put in. This is not a large amount of data. This is something that this information will be saved only for that part of the conversation, or those turns of the conversation. The moment the user says goodbye, that gets cleared out. It's no longer stored. And so it's really great when you're trying to gather different pieces to generate a query. You could save it to there. Then once you make the query, then you could clear that out. And so we're going to save it for here because we're going to ask the user if we want to save their zip code for later. So we're going to save it to there. Then, of course, the action gives the message of the animals that they could find. And then it gives this message of, should I remember the zip code for the next time? And we're using confirmations. And confirmations is a helper where we have multiple different helpers that you could use that we provide that do different functionalities. This one will handle the yes, no type of questions. And it does all the variations of sure, yeah, and tries to suss out and get an actual yes or no from the user. So Google Assistant, if the user kind of gives something vague, will reiterate and make sure they get an explicit yes or no for this yes or no question. So that's the first turn of conversation after the user gives a zip code. Then it goes to the user, and the user says yes or no. If the user says yes or no, it's going to hit our remember zip intent, and it's going to pass in confirmation into that particular function. And if it's true, if they did say yes, what we're going to do is we're going to get now from com.data, which is short-term saving of data, we're going to grab that zip code and now add it to com.user storage. That is long-term storage where it's going to be saved over multiple conversations. And so if I talk to Cathy once and I save her zip code, the next time I talk to Cathy in 3 weeks, I will still have her zip code. So this is long-term saving. And then, of course, I'm going to acknowledge the user, saying, OK, I'll remember that, and continue the conversation. And of course, we don't want to forget that if the user says no or they declined, we will acknowledge that, say no worries, and then continue the conversation as well. So just want to note that whenever you're accessing user storage, if you are in countries that have regulations that require developers to obtain consent when obtaining user information, you must use the confirmation helper when it comes to that. So if you operate in these countries that have these restrictions, please take note of that. So helpers. Confirmation is one of them, and we provide other ways that you can get information from the user that's really common. For me, I don't really necessarily want to ask the user for their zip code raw. I want to be able to ask it using place. That way I can get their location. You can also get other common things like their name, their photo, their email by using permission. And then other information like Google Sign-In, where you can have them log into your account as well. So helpers are ways that we provide where you can get information from the user, and Google Assistant will temporarily take control of the conversation to handle that request as well. So I definitely highly recommend using these to get data from the user, especially when it comes to names, because we all spell names slightly different. That way you can get the actual name of the user.
All right. So earlier I talked a bit about when things maybe don't go quite right, when somebody says something that you didn't expect and there's some sort of error. Now, humans have misunderstandings all the time where we mishear each other or misunderstand each other, but we don't call those hiccups errors. I don't say, oh, I was talking to Jessica last night and we had 3 errors. Because we're so good at repairing the conversation gracefully. And you can apply that same principle to help your users get back on track when they stumble in your action. Hey, Jessica, what'd you do last night?
I went to Abuelita.
Sorry, you went where?
Abuelitas.
Oh, great restaurant. See right there, we had an error, but we did a repair. We quickly got back on track. And again, if you follow some of these best practices, your actions can be that smooth as well. Let's look at an example using a sample dialogue of, again, a fake action we designed called Cathy's Chocolate Shop, where maybe we didn't handle the error case very well. Will you be my user again?
Of course, Cathy.
All right, let's go.
Okay, Google, talk to Cathy's Chocolate Shop.
Welcome to Cathy's Chocolate Shop. I can give you chocolate recipes, tell you a chocolate fact, or play a trivia game. Which would you like?
Where can I buy your chocolates?
Sorry, I can't understand the command. Please say again.
Store locations?
Sorry, I can't understand the command. Please say again. Now, you might be thinking, I would never write a prompt like that. But believe me, I got this from a real-life example out there, so never say never. What you really need to do here is get people back on track by providing them information that's relevant right now. Context-sensitive error handling is key to building a successful action. So let's look at maybe how we could have handled this a little bit better. Let's try this again. Welcome to Cathy's Chocolate Shop. I can give you chocolate recipes, tell you a chocolate fact, or play a trivia game. Which would you like?
Where can I buy your chocolates?
I have chocolate recipes, chocolate facts, and a trivia game. Which one would you like? So here, all we've done is restate the options that are available at that time. And most of the time, something like this is going to get people on track and back on their merry way. There's another type of error prompt you can do, which is similar, but it's a little faster, and it's called a rapid reprompt. And that works great if you've only got maybe one or two types of things you're asking for. So let's hear how that one sounds. Welcome to Cathy's Chocolate Shop. Which would you like?
How about a recipe?
Sure, recipes. Do you prefer dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Well, I like 65% is good.
Sorry, do you prefer dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Dark.
So here, again, people say things in a huge variety of ways. And if you're a big chocolate fan, you might want to talk about the percentage of chocolate that you like. But maybe my action doesn't understand that. So I can quickly get them back on track with just dark or milk. Another thing that you can do to be really nice to your users is to acknowledge when there are things that you can't do. We humans long to be understood. It is very important to us. Imagine I went to a hotel and I'm talking to the concierge and I say, hey, can you rent me a car? And they say, I don't understand. Would you like me to make dinner reservations? I'd be like, no, can you rent me a car? It wouldn't make a lot of sense. What they're really more likely to say is, sorry, I can't rent you a car. Are you interested in dinner reservations? So you should do something like that for your action. So let's see what that sounds like. Welcome to Cathy's Chocolate Shop. Which would you like?
Where can I buy your chocolates?
Sorry, I'm not able to provide store locations yet. You can find locations on our website, cathy.chocolate.com. Can I help with anything else? So again, it was a very explicit acknowledgement. We didn't just say, I can't do that. We said, I can't do store locations. This also saves your user a lot of frustration because you got to remember, when somebody comes into your action and they ask for something that you don't have, they don't necessarily know, is it that your action doesn't do that? Or did I just say it wrong? Did I use the wrong keyword? How about store locations? How about where can I buy? How about where are your stores? They're going to be banging their head against the wall thinking, I don't have the keyword, I got to keep trying. When you stop and say, hey, I can't do that thing, then they know, oh, okay, and they can move on with their lives and stop being so frustrated. And the last thing I want to say about error handling is called escalated error. Sometimes when you give them that first error prompt, it's not going to give them all the information they really need. Most of the time, it's going to get them back on track. But if they have another error right away, it probably means you didn't give them enough information. So you want to give them a bit more detail. So let's see how that one sounds. Oops. Okay, Dark, are you interested in a recipe that's quick, or do you have more time?
Well, I mean, my partner's birthday's tomorrow. So,
Sorry, was that a quick recipe or something longer?
I mean, how long is it going to take?
You can either choose something quick, which is under 30 minutes, or longer, which could be 30 minutes to overnight. Which one would you like?
30 minutes then.
So
Something quick.
again, when Jessica had an error the second time, I obviously wasn't helping her enough. She needed to know, well, what the heck does quick mean before she could make a decision? So that's when you want to get into a slightly longer prompt with a bit more information that'll get them back on track. And check out the Google I/O 2019 action to hear some good examples of context-sensitive error handling. I want to say something a little bit about persona. When somebody hears a voice or hears your action, within the first second, they have already made a mental model of who is talking. It's just something we do as humans all the time. So you really want to get ahead of that and define the persona or the personality of your action so they don't do it for you. Now, this talk is not going to get deep into persona. I highly recommend last year's talk by Wally Brill, Creating a Persona, What Does Your Product Sound Like? He gets into great detail there. The one thing I do want to mention is, if you're working on your action, building it in Dialogflow, how do you know you're still following the guidelines you set for your persona? So I'm going to take an example from Wally's talk that you're making like an airline action. And imagine that you've defined your persona to be pretty casual, pretty friendly, and you've gotten to the point where you're writing a prompt when you can't find the user's reservation. And you might write something like this: I'm sorry, but I am unable to find your reservation. So let's hear what that actually sounds like in the console.
Yep, so we're going to go back to the console. I've refreshed my action. That's the same IO action, so let's start it.
Sure, here's the test version of my test app.
Hello there again. See, I remembered that we've talked before. Don't you feel seen?
Okay, so let me do reservation so I can get that.
I am sorry, but I am unable to find your reservation.
I know it's a bit subtle, but to me, that just doesn't sound very good. It's really formal and stiff. It's long. It doesn't use a contraction. And it might be how we would write something, but when you say it out loud, it just isn't, that's not the way I would say it, or a friendly customer service agent. So let's tweak it a bit. Let's make it a little bit shorter. Let's put in a contraction and hear how this sounds.
So let's update and listen.
Sorry, but I can't find your reservation.
That sounds a lot better to me. Again, it's a kind of a subtle change, but to me that's much more how I would naturally say it. As we mentioned before, you're probably not going to get the chance to listen to every single prompt in your action, and that's okay. But you should focus on some of the key areas, such as your initial prompt, and also maybe places where there might be some emotional reaction going on. Here you've just told your poor user that you cannot find their airline reservation. They're probably going to be a bit upset. So those are the kinds of places where you want to spend some extra time thinking about, listening to, and designing your prompts. And to finish this off, Jessica's going to talk about how to improve your action by looking at the logs.
Thanks, Cathy. So we spent a lot of time talking about conversation, and I hope you do that and build your conversation design really well. And then after you do that, you're going to build your action, and then you're going to put it for production. And once you put it in production, your action is available on over 1 billion devices. And something that's really cool about Google Assistant is that our actions, once they're deployed and they're on production level, there's no downloading needed for the user. The user could just simply say, hey Google, talk to, and then the action's name, which is fantastic. So most likely you'll get some users right away because people will be finding your action. So I'm going to talk about one particular thing, but want to highlight, in Dialogflow, there are 3 different components that I highly recommend for developers to use after your action's deployed to look into so you can make your action better. First thing is training. Next one is history. And then analytics. Each of these are fantastic, but today we're going to go over training and talk more about that. And so this is a page view of the training, and here you can actually see the different conversations you have with users. And of course, these logs do not obtain or have any identifying information about users. They're just the raw utterances that users have with your action. So let's click on one and see what's in there. So this is an interaction that a user had with my action. And let's walk through this interaction. So the first thing that happens is the Google Assistant triggers my welcome intent, which my action does welcome to GDG San Francisco. Then after that, the user said this: how many peeps do you have? Which my action did not know what to do, and so it hit my fallback intent. And so it gave a kind of a generic statement of like, sorry, what was that? Which isn't a good experience for the user. And most likely, this term peeps is slang in English, where it usually refers to people. And so I'm assuming that this user meant, how many members do you have? But they said it slightly different, and I didn't take account for that. And so what I could do is I could click next to the intents, and here it gives me a list of all the intents I currently have. And there I could choose to see which intent does it best match with that the user should be able to get in return. This one in particular is my member's intent. So I click on that, and now, the next time a user says, how many peeps do you have? It's going to trigger my member intent for that user. When you do this, what happens in the back end is Dialogflow grabs that user utterance, so how many pieces do you have, and adds that to the intent training phrases. So now it's included in that model for you, which is fantastic. And of course, there's going to be times where you're going to have interaction that you didn't necessarily expect. And so here, you could still click on that, and there's an option on the bottom called Create New. In here, you can create a new intent. Name it whatever you want it to be. So for the example of the chocolate store stores, store locations, you could create that intent, grab that utterance, and then go to the intents portion in Dialogflow, and then give a response there and have that bit built out. And so you can add that functionality while you're going through your logs, which is great. So we talked a lot about many things, so let's do a quick recap.
So first we learned how to get started, sample dialogues. Write them down.
Yeah, and of course you want to say it out loud. So you want to read all your sample dialogue out loud. And then of course you want to spend some time setting expectations in the greetings for your users. And then of course you want to be able to customize those greetings for users who come back for your action. And then don't forget to personalize the experience by using helper methods.
We also learned how to get users back on track when they say things your action didn't expect and repair the conversation gracefully. Right, Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica.
Sorry, did you hear the part about the error handling?
I did, yeah.
All right. Another thing you can do is to double check that you're building according to the spec you set for your persona. And you can do that by listening to your prompts out loud throughout the building process.
And of course, modifying them using SSML so you can create really rich experience for your users. And then finally, once your action's out for production, go through the log so you can make your action even better.
If you want to get started building actions, we've got a lot of great resources for you. There's action on Google Docs, conversation design best practices, and of course, code labs to see examples of things people have already built. Thank you so much.
Thank you.